On a cold morning in the heart of Germany, a man desperate to make a job interview took a shortcut through a quiet, ancient forest. That choice saved him no time, but it cost him something else. Now, days later, people are getting sick, animals won't go near him, and in every mirror, someone else is there, watching. What exactly did he bring back from that forest? And is it really still following him? Thomas had always prided himself on being practical, someone who didn't let stories or superstition cloud his judgment. So when his rental car broke down in a remote part of southern Germany and the GPS suggested a 3-hour detour on winding rural roads, he panicked. He had just one shot at making it to the interview in Munich, a job that could finally pull him out of his dead-end IT support position. The only chance he had now was a narrow footpath that the village mechanic claimed led straight through the forest and would save him over an hour. It wasn't on any digital map, but it was well trodden, according to the man. Against his better judgment, Thomas decided to go for it. Slinging his backpack over one shoulder and checking his phone's battery, already down to 28%, he stepped into the shade of the trees. The path was narrow but clear. Leaves crunched beneath his boots, and early morning fog laced through the trunks. Birds chirped overhead, and for a moment, it even felt peaceful. He kept glancing at his watch. Every second mattered. But soon, the dense foliage muted the light, and the silence deepened. The further he walked, the more unnatural it felt. There were no fallen branches, no bird calls, not even the sound of wind. Just the steady sound of his own steps. After 30 minutes, he paused to sip from his water bottle. That's when he noticed it. Every time he stopped walking, the echo of his steps seemed to lag by half a second, as if someone else were still walking just behind him. He turned around quickly. Nothing. Just trees. He shook it off. He was tired and stressed. The brain played tricks under pressure, he reminded himself. But as he continued, the forest felt aware. Trees leaned slightly toward the trail, like silent spectators. The path, which had started out wide enough for a small cart, had slowly narrowed to a thin strip. He stepped over rocks that hadn't been there earlier and felt the terrain subtly shifting underfoot, like the trail itself was moving. That's when he noticed the carvings, small symbols etched into tree trunks in odd, geometric patterns. Some looked fresh. Others looked ancient. He pulled out his phone to snap a photo but groaned when he saw the battery had dropped to 7%, even though he hadn't used it. Then it died completely. Black screen. No signal. No compass. Just silence. He should have turned around. Any normal person would have. But Thomas wasn't normal when under stress. He was stubborn. And he needed that job. So he kept walking, trying to remember the map the mechanic drew on the back of a receipt. 2 left turns, then a straight path until a fork, then right. Or was it left at the fork? He cursed softly. At some point, the fog began to thicken. Trees appeared to move slightly when not in focus. A branch snapped behind him, and he spun around, breath caught in his throat. Still nothing. He walked faster. Then, something new, a wooden post ahead, a small sign in carved German script that read Wander nicht, wo Glocken klingen. He typed the phrase into his offline translation app, do not wander where bells ring. That was specific. And strange. He laughed nervously. Probably an old warning against hunters or mines. Still, his pace slowed. The trail beyond the sign seemed darker, even though it was still morning. That's when he heard it, the faintest chime. One soft, singular bell tone in the distance. He froze. There was no church for miles, he was sure of that. He looked around. The trees stood still. The sound had no direction, like it came from inside his own ears. He turned back to retrace his steps, but the trail was gone. Where the dirt path once clearly ran behind him, there were now roots, leaves, and untouched forest floor. He walked back a few meters, confused. No path. Not even his own footprints. Just trees and fog. That was impossible. His heart began to race. He shouted out, just a loud hello, to anyone who might be nearby. The forest answered with absolute silence. Not even an echo. The bell rang again. Louder. Closer. He broke into a jog, trying to follow where the trail should be, crashing through underbrush and ignoring the scratches on his arms and face. That's when the smell hit him, burnt metal and damp moss, like something old and decaying but electric. It made him gag. He stumbled onto a clearing he hadn't seen before. In the center was an old wooden bench, moss-covered and cracked. Sitting on it was a backpack just like his. But he had his backpack on. He slowly approached, heart hammering. It was identical. Same color, same worn-out strap, even the same red stain from a spilled energy drink. He reached out and touched it. It was real. Zipping it open, he found his ID, his wallet, his notes for the interview. Everything. But how? He looked around frantically. No one. And yet, he felt eyes on him, like the forest was holding its breath. He stood there, gripping the duplicate bag, unsure what to do next. Then, he heard footsteps. Slow, crunching leaves. From the trees behind him. But when he turned, nothing again. That's when he realized he hadn't been alone since the first bell. Thomas stood frozen in that small clearing, staring down at the twin of his own backpack while the air around him seemed to thicken. There was no wind, but the leaves rustled softly, as if whispering to one another about his presence. He reached behind his neck to wipe away the cold sweat forming there, only to find his skin clammy and ice-cold. He tried to reason with himself. Maybe someone else had come through here before him. Maybe a hiker with the same brand of bag. A coincidence. Nothing more. But deep down, the part of his mind that didn't need logic or facts to understand fear knew better. His fingers trembled as he zipped up the second backpack and left it where it was. He couldn't carry both, and something about touching it for too long made his head spin. He stepped back toward where he thought the trail continued, though it was just another corridor of trees that looked exactly like the last one. His legs moved automatically, one step after another, but the direction didn't feel like his own choice anymore. The forest seemed to guide him, as though it was leading him somewhere. After about 10 minutes, the sound of footsteps behind him returned. This time, they didn't try to hide. They matched his pace, stayed the same distance away, and paused when he paused. He turned and scanned the trees, searching for movement. There was nothing, not even a squirrel. The silence became unbearable. So he tried to speak, his voice low and uncertain. "Hello. Is someone there?" The forest swallowed his voice again. No echo. No reply. Then he heard it, whispers. Very soft, like distant voices carried by the wind. He couldn't make out the words, but they were definitely there. He spun in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint the direction, but the whispers moved with him. No matter which way he turned, they stayed just behind him. His pulse raced. He considered turning back again, but the way behind him didn't look familiar anymore. Trees had shifted. Paths had vanished. And even if he wanted to retrace his steps, there was no before anymore, only more trees. He walked faster, and the whispers grew more insistent. They started to form patterns, rhythmic, almost like chanting. Still, the words were foreign. The tone was neither friendly nor aggressive, just wrong. Unnatural. He clamped his hands over his ears and picked up his pace, but the sound remained inside his head. That's when he passed a tree with deep gouges carved into it. For long, ragged slashes, as though something had dragged its claws through the bark. A few meters later, another tree. Same markings. Then another. The cuts were fresh, still seeping sap. His breath came in short bursts. He stumbled over a root and caught himself, hands sinking into the soft moss. That's when he noticed the symbols on the ground, spirals made of small stones, laid out in careful circles that had clearly not formed by nature. He stepped back from them like they were burning. Around him, the whispering intensified. He shouted, trying to drown it out, but his own voice sounded distant, like it didn't belong to him anymore. Then something new happened. A light breeze blew past his left cheek. It was cold, but more importantly, it smelled like perfume. Faint, flowery, familiar. His mother's perfume. She had died years ago. He turned around. No one. But he swore he heard her voice in the whispering now, calling his name, the way she used to when he was a child playing too far from home. Thomas. He staggered backward and fell. The impact jarred his senses, and for a second, everything stopped, the whispers, the sounds, even the breeze. And then he saw something. Between the trees, no more than 20 feet away, was a figure. Tall, thin, and impossibly still. Its limbs were too long. Its body too narrow. It didn't move or breathe. It just watched. Its face was wrong. Not terrifying in the traditional way, but empty. Too smooth. Too clean. Like a mask carved from bone. Thomas scrambled to his feet and bolted in the opposite direction. Branches slapped his face, thorns tore at his jeans. He ran blindly, dodging trees, until he collapsed again near a fallen log. Gasping for breath, he looked around, heart pounding in his ears. Nothing followed. The forest had returned to stillness. But when he looked down, he realized something was clutched in his hand. A strip of cloth. He didn't remember grabbing it, but it was there, dark red and faded, with strange stitched patterns. It wasn't his. And it smelled faintly like that same floral perfume. He dropped it and backed away. The sun had begun to dip behind the trees, though it felt like he hadn't been walking that long. The shadows stretched longer now, deeper. He checked his phone again, even though he knew it was dead. It flickered once, showed a blank screen with a single line of static across it, and went black again. Then he heard laughter, childlike, high-pitched, but hollow. It came from behind the trees. He turned, squinting. Nothing. When he looked forward again, the path was different. The trees had realigned again. New symbols on the trunks, new stones on the ground. Something was playing with him. Testing him. And worst of all, it seemed to know who he was. Thomas kept moving, though every step felt heavier, like the forest was pulling at his ankles. The strange laughter had faded, but a new unease had taken its place, something quieter, colder. The air was damp now, clinging to his skin like a second layer. He couldn't tell how much time had passed. It felt like hours, but the light hadn't changed much. The forest had a way of trapping time, stretching it until moments bled into one another. He stopped to catch his breath near a leaning tree with roots curling above the ground like claws. He leaned against it and let his eyes close for a second. Just 1 second. When he opened them again, there was someone standing in the path ahead. The man hadn't made a sound. He was just there, as if the forest had breathed him out. He looked to be in his 60s, his skin pale and paper-thin, stretched tightly over sharp cheekbones. He wore a dirty brown coat, several sizes too large, and a cap that shadowed most of his face. Thomas stood still. The man didn't speak. He just stared, his mouth slightly open, like he was trying to remember how to talk. Thomas took a cautious step forward and said, "Hey, are you okay?" The man blinked slowly and tilted his head. Then he whispered, "Turn around." His voice was cracked and dry, like leaves crushed underfoot. Thomas furrowed his brow. "What?" The old man raised a shaky finger and pointed behind him. "Don't go where the bells are loud. They know your name now." His tone was flat, lifeless. Thomas looked over his shoulder. Nothing. When he turned back, the man was gone. No footsteps. No movement. Just an empty trail. His heart started to pound. He moved toward where the old man had stood, searching the trees, but there was no trace of anyone. No footprints. No broken branches. Just moss and silence. Then he saw it. A small object on the ground where the man had been. He bent down and picked it up. A tiny bell, no bigger than a walnut, tarnished and worn. It jingled once in his hand, softly, like it didn't want to be heard. He stared at it, confused, then stuffed it into his pocket and moved on, trying to shake off the encounter. But something about that bell clung to him. Its weight felt too heavy for its size, like it carried more than just metal. As he walked, he began to notice a shift in the forest. The trees weren't just silent now, they were expectant. The path curved in ways it hadn't before. He passed landmarks he was sure he'd already seen, like the forest was looping him back into places he'd already escaped. The second time he passed a large, heart-shaped stone in the middle of the path, he stopped. "No," he whispered aloud. He had turned left at the fork earlier, so he tried right this time, forcing his way through thick brush and tangled roots. That's when the whispering returned, Louder this time, almost chanting. His name. He was sure of it now. Thomas, drawn out and echoing unnaturally, as if a dozen voices tried to say it at once. Then, through the trees, he saw a structure, a tiny wooden hut, partially hidden by vines and half sunken into the earth. Its roof sagged and its door hung crooked on one hinge. He shouldn't go near it. Every instinct told him to stay away. But something else, curiosity, desperation, maybe even whatever was guiding the forest, pulled him toward it. He pushed the door open slowly. It creaked, then gave way. Inside, dust danced in the thin shafts of light that made it through the cracks. There were bones on the floor. Small ones. Animal, maybe. Or not. A table stood in the center, and on it was a journal, its leather cover worn thin. He opened it carefully. The handwriting was jagged, messy, and seemed to get worse as the pages went on. The entries described a man lost in the forest, like him, who had heard bells and whispers and seen a thing with no face. He wrote of being watched, followed, mimicked. Then one line, near the end, made Thomas's blood run cold. It can't leave the forest unless you invite it. The final page was blank, except for a symbol etched in something dark. The same spiral he'd seen earlier. He dropped the book and backed away, suddenly aware that the air had gone still again. He turned to leave, and that's when he heard the bell. Not faint like before. Loud. Clear. Right outside the hut. He crept to the doorway and peeked out. A figure was standing just beyond the threshold. Its back was to him, but he could see that its limbs were wrong, bent where they shouldn't be. It stood perfectly still. The bell chimed once more, though it didn't move. Then it turned its head. Not its body, just the head, slowly, until it faced him. Its face was his. Thomas's face. But blank. Expressionless. Like it had been copied from memory, but something was missing. He stumbled back, knocking over a chair. The thing stepped forward. The bell rang again. It didn't blink. Didn't breathe. Just stared with that too perfect face. Thomas didn't wait. He ran. He didn't look back. Trees whipped past him, and the whispers grew frantic, like the forest itself was panicking. The bell kept ringing, each chime sharper than the last. He didn't stop until his legs gave out and he collapsed in a patch of ferns, gasping for breath. The sounds faded again. He lay there, heart hammering, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. It had his face. That thing in the forest had his face. And it was watching. Waiting. Thomas lay motionless in the undergrowth, every muscle tight and alert, listening for any sound that might signal the thing had followed him. But the forest was once again holding its breath. The silence wasn't comforting, it was loud, pressing, like it didn't want to be broken. He sat up slowly, checking his surroundings. There were no footprints, no movement, and no sign of the faceless version of himself he had just seen. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer alone, not in the way he had felt before, with shadows in the trees or whispers in the wind. This was different. Whatever had appeared to him was no longer watching from a distance. It had taken interest. It had noticed him. And now, it was following. He stood and moved carefully, sticking to soft patches of moss and avoiding the crunch of dry leaves. Every noise he made felt like a shout in the stillness. The light filtering through the canopy above had changed. It wasn't dusk yet, but it looked darker, thicker, like the air itself had dimmed. He kept walking, unsure of where the trail was or even if there was one anymore. There were no markers, no signs, just tree after tree after tree. At one point, he passed a circle of mushrooms perfectly arranged in the shape of an eye. He didn't stop to study it. Every oddity he passed now felt like a test, and he wasn't sure what failing meant anymore. His legs burned from the uneven ground, but he kept moving, driven by fear and a need to escape, even if he didn't know which direction led out. That's when the bells began. Not a single chime like before, but a series. Faint at first. Gentle, even. Like wind chimes moving in a soft breeze. But there was no breeze. The air was still, thick as fog. The sound came from behind, and Thomas froze. He turned his head slowly, but there was nothing visible. The forest stood quiet, trees unmoving, shadows long. Then came a second chime. Closer. Sharper. He turned and began walking, then jogging, then running. The bells picked up pace, each ring cutting through the silence like a knife. No matter how fast he moved, they stayed close, just a few paces behind, never gaining, never falling behind. Just following. He ducked beneath low branches, leapt over roots, and burst into another clearing. This one was larger and held something new, stone ruins, half swallowed by the earth. Broken pillars and slabs covered in moss stood like the remains of a forgotten altar. In the center was a stone basin, filled with water so still it looked like glass. Thomas stepped toward it, drawn without understanding why. He looked down into the water. His reflection stared back, but it wasn't right. The face was his, but the eyes were black, empty voids. The mouth moved even though he wasn't speaking. It whispered his name. Thomas. He recoiled, falling back and scraping his palms on the stone. The bells rang louder. He turned to run again and crashed into something. Someone. He stumbled back, breath caught, and saw a woman standing in front of him. Her skin was pale, her hair long and tangled, dressed in tattered clothes that looked like they were from another century. Her eyes were wide, too wide, and she whispered, "You heard the bells. You let them hear you." Her mouth moved slowly, like it hurt to speak. It follows sound. That's how it learns you. Don't let it hear your thoughts. He didn't understand. He shook his head, trying to form a question, but she was already backing away, melting into the trees like smoke. Gone. Thomas was trembling. The bells had stopped, but he didn't feel safe. He took off again, ducking into the thickest part of the woods, hoping the dense trees would slow whatever was following him. But the forest was changing. The trees leaned in closer, their trunks twisted unnaturally. Strange markings were etched into the bark, faces, dozens of them, some human, some animal, all distorted. The ground began to slope upward, and he found himself climbing a hill of roots and broken stones. At the top, he reached another path. This one was made of smooth black soil, and it stretched forward in a perfectly straight line. He didn't trust it, but he had no other options. He followed the path, breathing hard, until he noticed the forest on either side wasn't silent anymore. It was humming. Low, deep, like the sound came from beneath the ground. Each step he took made the hum grow louder, as if the forest itself had a heartbeat. Then, the bells returned. Not behind him this time, but ahead. He stopped. The sound was unmistakable. A soft, hollow chime, like metal swinging on a string. He tried to backtrack, but the soil behind him had vanished. The path only led forward now. The chime came again. Then a whisper. You invited it. The trees began to move, not sway, but shift, subtly, bending inwards like they were trying to close the path. Shadows thickened. He moved forward, one cautious step at a time. The bells grew louder, constant now. Not just one, but many. The air pulsed with them. Thomas looked down and realized his shadow was wrong. It moved slightly out of sync with his body. When he lifted his arm, the shadow lagged behind by a second, then caught up. His breath caught in his throat. It was mimicking him. Not just following, but copying. He ran. Again. Down the path, ignoring the pain in his legs, the pounding in his chest. The bells chased him, louder and louder, until they were deafening. He broke through a final line of trees, and everything changed. Suddenly, he was in open space. Grass beneath his feet. A wide dirt road. A distant farmhouse. The sky above was blue again. He had made it out. He dropped to his knees, gasping for breath, tears in his eyes. He was free. Or so he thought. Then he noticed the silence. No birds. No wind. Just his own gasping breath. He looked down at his shadow. It stood still. Then it waved at him. Thomas stumbled away from the waving shadow, unsure if he had seen it right or if his mind was finally cracking under pressure. But he didn't wait to find out. He forced himself to stand and run again, this time down the dirt road toward the farmhouse in the distance. As he ran, he told himself that it was over. He had made it out. Whatever had happened in the forest, whatever was chasing him, it couldn't exist out here. Not in the open. Not where the world made sense again. But even as he tried to believe that, his stomach twisted with the same sick fear that had started the moment the first bell rang. He glanced behind him every few steps, expecting to see something slithering through the trees, or worse, a version of himself staring back with that lifeless, perfect face. But the road was empty. By the time he reached the farmhouse, the sun had lowered, painting the sky with gold and purple. The house was old but well kept, with flower pots by the windows and smoke drifting gently from the chimney. He ran to the door and knocked hard. A moment later, a woman in her 70s opened it, her face lined but kind. She looked surprised, maybe even alarmed, but she didn't hesitate to invite him in. He collapsed onto a bench just inside the entrance, too exhausted to speak at first. She gave him water and sat nearby, watching him like she was trying to figure out what had just blown into her quiet life. After a few minutes, he managed to say thank you, his voice hoarse and shaky. "The forest," he whispered. "Something's wrong with that forest." The woman didn't speak right away. She looked toward the window, as if checking that the trees hadn't followed him, then said softly, "You came from the North Trail?" He nodded. Her face paled. "People stopped using that trail a long time ago. Some who take it don't come back the same." Thomas tried to explain what he saw, but the words didn't come out right. The bells, the whispers, the shadow with his face, it all sounded insane, even to him. She didn't laugh. She just listened, her eyes growing more distant the longer he spoke. When he finished, she said, "You should sleep. It's safe here, for now." He took the spare room and collapsed into bed without changing clothes. His dreams were a mess of trees and mirrors and voices that called him by name, but when he woke up, the sun was shining and birds were chirping. It felt normal again. Maybe it had all been in his head. He washed up, thanked the woman, and set off toward the nearby village the woman had told him about. It wasn't far, just a short walk down a gravel path. He found a small store, bought a new phone charger, and tried to call a taxi to get to the train station. He didn't tell anyone in the village what happened. He didn't think they'd believe him. But the longer he stayed outside the forest, the stranger things felt. It started small. People stared at him for just a bit too long, as if they sensed something was wrong. Dogs barked at him on sight, growling and backing away with their tails between their legs. Babies cried when he entered a room. He tried to shake it off, to focus on getting to Munich. But then he saw his reflection. In the window of the cafe, just before boarding the train. It looked like him, but didn't move when he turned away. It stared just a second too long. He stood there, frozen, watching the reflection as it blinked after he had already turned. On the train, the lights above him flickered. The people in his car began coughing, then sneezing. One woman sitting near him looked pale, her eyes red. He tried to ignore it, but by the time the train reached Munich, 2 passengers had collapsed and were taken off by ambulance. He checked into a cheap hotel near the station and locked the door behind him. That night, he saw it again. In the mirror above the sink. A figure standing behind him, unmoving, featureless, but unmistakably shaped like him. He turned fast, but no one was there. Just an empty bathroom. The reflection was back to normal. The next day, he tried to get back to normal life. He made it to the interview, somehow pulled himself together enough to sound confident, and even smiled a few times. They offered him the job on the spot. But when he shook the manager's hand, the woman flinched. She looked into his eyes and froze, like she had seen something else staring back. He left quickly. That night, it happened again. He turned off the light to go to bed, and something whispered from the corner of the room. Not in words. Just the sound of breath, steady and close. When he turned on the light, there was nothing. But the next morning, he found small marks on the inside of his window, fingerprints on the glass. From the inside. He didn't sleep after that. He stayed up night after night, watching mirrors, avoiding windows, never turning his back to a dark room. He checked out of the hotel and moved to another, then another. But it followed. Wherever he went, the signs returned. Bells chiming softly in his dreams. Whispers that matched his own thoughts. Reflections that moved just a second too late. He even tried going to a clinic, thinking maybe something in the forest had poisoned him. The doctor said his blood work was fine, But as she left the room, she glanced back at him through the glass door and never came back. The receptionist said she had gone home sick. Thomas realized something terrible. He had left the forest, but he had not come out alone. Whatever had watched him, chased him, copied him, it had found a way through. It wasn't attacking. It wasn't harming. It was waiting, learning, mimicking. And the longer it stayed near people, the more they changed. They got sick. They saw things. Their eyes lost color. It was like the forest had attached itself to him, and now it was bleeding into the rest of the world, one step at a time. He couldn't tell anyone. He couldn't even prove it. But every day he woke up, the reflection grew more real, and he felt less like himself. Thomas felt trapped inside a nightmare that no one else could see. Every mirror in his small apartment became a window to another world, a world where his reflection no longer belonged to him. At first, the figure behind him in the glass was vague, just a shadow that flickered when he moved too quickly. But over days, it grew clearer, more defined. It mimicked his every movement but lacked his warmth. The eyes were empty, cold voids. He tried covering all mirrors, but reflections appeared elsewhere, in windows of passing cars, in shiny surfaces like spoons and phone screens. No matter how hard he tried to avoid it, he couldn't escape the thing that shared his face but not his soul. The sickness in the village grew worse. People he had met only briefly began disappearing. Friends of friends suddenly fell ill. Some vanished without explanation. Local doctors called it an unknown illness, but everyone whispered about the forest. Thomas tried to warn people, but no one believed him. To them, he looked like a man losing his mind, haunted by stories no one else heard. He felt the isolation tighten around him like a shroud. At night, the whispers returned. Not just in his head but in the dark corners of his room, soft voices calling his name, chanting in languages he couldn't understand. The bells chimed again. Faint at first, then louder, more insistent. He began to see the figure not just in reflections, but standing behind him when no one else was around. It didn't speak. It didn't move. It just watched, its face a perfect copy of his own but empty, like a mask waiting to replace him. Sometimes, when he blinked, he thought it reached out with ghostly hands, trying to touch him through the glass. He avoided looking at himself for as long as possible, but when he caught a glimpse, he noticed changes. His eyes looked duller. His skin paler. His voice sometimes sounded different, deeper, as if the forest's presence was leaking into him. He feared he was becoming like the thing following him, an echo, a hollow imitation. Thomas sought help. He found a local priest known for strange cases. The priest listened silently as Thomas described the forest, the bells, the shadow with his face. The priest nodded slowly and told him of old legends, spirits trapped between worlds, taking what they needed to survive. He warned Thomas that the forest's hold didn't end at its edges. Once it found a host, it could follow. It could live inside. The only way to stop it was to face it where it began. To go back into the forest and confront what had attached itself to him. Thomas was terrified but understood. He was caught between worlds. Between himself and something else. He packed lightly and returned to the village near the forest's edge. The air felt thicker there. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, waiting. He stepped onto the old path, the one no one dared to take, and walked into the shadow of the forest once again. The bells began to ring, soft and distant. He didn't run. He faced the quiet dread growing inside him. With each step, he felt the presence in him stir, a battle between the man he was and the thing trying to claim him. The forest seemed to pulse, alive and hungry. The whispering voices surrounded him, calling out secrets and warnings. Deep inside the woods, he found the clearing where the ruins stood. The stone basin shimmered with an unnatural light. Thomas stared into the water. The face looking back was both his and not his. The shadow stepped out from the darkness behind him, silent but watching. Thomas knew what he had to do. He reached inside the basin and pulled out a small, cold bell, the one that started it all. Holding it tightly, he rang it once. The sound echoed through the trees, sharp and clear. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering. Thomas called out to it, demanding it leave him, demanding it let him be free. The forest trembled. The shadows shifted. When the ringing stopped, the silence was complete. Thomas felt the weight inside him lighten, the sickness ease. He looked around. The shadow was gone. The whispers ceased. The forest held its breath. Thomas stepped back onto the path and walked out of the woods, his reflection now whole, his eyes clear. But as he left, a single bell chimed softly, far behind him, carried on the wind. A warning or a promise that some things never truly leave. He didn't look back. He never would.